Hello, I'm Nathan Martin with the Divine Pollination Hive and the UnityProcess.com. We've got Dylan Moore back with us this time, and we are going to be discussing the burden of proof and how it relates to as a logical fallacy, how it relates within philosophy, and how it can be weaponized to really, mess with people as a predatory way of messing with them. Also, we're going to look at the zero null way of looking at it where, we'll talk about that too. So let's start off really quick and take a look at the burden of proof, what it is from Wikipedia when it's talking about in law. Well, that's the other place. It's also in law. So philosophy, law, and logic. So the burden of proof is the obligation of a party in a trial to produce the evidence that will prove the claims they have made against the other party. In a legal dispute, one party is initially presumed to be correct and gets the benefit of the doubt, while the other side bears the burden of proof. So I'll just give a really quick example. In America, it is guilty, or it is innocent until proven guilty. So
I think you had it right. It's becoming more and more that way as time comes on.
Yeah, we've definitely become the opposite. We become guilty until proven innocent, especially in the public court of opinion. But when it comes to the law, still, at least, it's at least in most cases supposed to be that. So it's incumbent upon the state, for example, to prove that this person that they are prosecuting for, like, say, a crime of some sort, actually committed the crime, and they have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that happened, and then a jury of the peers has to agree that actually happened, and if even one person thinks that maybe it didn't, then you would have a hung jury. So it's very difficult in some cases if there's not like an admission of guilt or overt proof to prove something like that. What would be the benefits of innocent until proven guilty in the burden of proof in court?
You asking me directly, or is that
a
rhetorical question?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of obvious the fact that the United States kind of really championed this idea in its Constitution was based on the fact that if you're guilty until proven innocent, well, then it's just whoever has enough power to wildly accuse anybody else to get them thrown into jail. Well, you get a pretty chaotic situation pretty quickly where nobody really knows what's going on because anybody could just make stuff up, and now everybody's guilty about this, and now we're throwing people in jail, and then it just becomes a power struggle, honestly, at that point, of who could gain power to attack the other person before they get it and attack you. I mean, I guess that's good.
Yeah, it would be very chaotic in one thing. And if it's not chaotic, then there's a very rigid hierarchical power structure that would basically kind of take over everything. And then whatever they say is actually true. And they're the ones with the best accusation.
So, I think innocent until proven guilty, lines up with reality in the sense that we don't really know what's going on. And as humans, we're constantly trying to figure out cause and effect of what's going on. And a lot of times we're wrong. And when we're wrong, there's a real cause and effect relationship that happens there, which is, I might die. Like if I'm wrong about this food I'm going to eat, it's actually poison, or I'm wrong about how dangerous that animal is and it's actually going to eat me, you just die. So, when we take that on to, okay, who's responsible for what, or we've evolved to come up with the concept of crimes because, in the lower animal kingdom, there's no such thing as crime. There's just power.
Right.
We extend that idea to say, okay, none of us necessarily know how things operate. So we have to have this very high standard before we say, okay, this is what actually caused that. Otherwise, we're going to be wildly guessing, and the punishment for guessing incorrectly can be very, very drastic.
Right. Okay.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah, sure. It did. It did. So, how does this apply in your mind to things like a debate?
Are we talking about two people who are interested in debating each other, or are we talking about someone who's a sophist?
Two people are interested in having a discussion.
Okay. Well, for people
A
who are
win-win,
interested
win-win discussion. Let's look at a
in,
win-win discussion.
okay. Well, in a win-win discussion, if we're having a debate or a debate that's where two people are willing to submit themselves to a superior argument, then the we're actually trying to figure out the truth of a situation.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're actually trying to figure out the truth of a situation, well, then we have to submit ourselves to the realities of cause and effect and the realities of the fact that it's very, very difficult to figure out cause and effect. And if we don't have the burden of proof, well, by default, we go into wildly guessing.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to have these standards and say, okay, in order to say that this cause leads to that effect, we have to have some objective way of measuring that, or else, again, we're just wildly guessing. So when we're in a discussion where we're trying to figure out the truth, and you have an idea that the truth might be X, and I have an idea that the truth might be Y, if we're having the burden of proof in that conversation, where it's like, well, I think it, most people think that it's X, but I think it's Y, and you're like, well, I think there's an establishment reason why it's X, so the burden of proof is actually on you to give me a reason why that's not the case.
Right.
So it's the importance in a debate is, how do I want to say it? I guess the same. I guess it's the same reason all the way down, to make sure that we don't just run into this wild guessing game. Because even in a debate, the consequences can be very, very real. Where, I mean, let's just take something that's like very, very rational, like engineering,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're trying to engineer a bridge. Well, if we don't use the burden of proof correctly and we design a bridge bad, the bridge might collapse and kill people.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, there's this very real application outside of this, fuzzy philosophical discussion stuff where, hey, if we don't do this correctly, there's real consequences in the real world.
So we have to kind of like scientifically prove something is going to work. So like in engineering, you're going to have to prove and do weight tests and understand that this structure is proven over time in history, and these materials based on these loads and stresses and et cetera, and with these elements and in these kind of a environment, say like in New York might be a different environment than Arizona.
Right.
You're going to have to prove that it's actually going to be able to be up to the task.
Right. Or even if I don't have any like historical stuff, the thing that popped into my head was actually Atlas Shrugged.
Okay.
You've read it, right?
I have not read it, but
okay. Part of Atlas Shrugged is one of the characters invents this new metal that he builds a bridge out of, and then like the whole media turns against him because they just assume that the new metal's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
But and for that, he didn't have any historical evidence, but he did have his scientific knowledge saying, okay, I understand that this metal I created can take a certain weight.
Mm-hmm.
And has certain qualities. And so using mathematics, I could figure out, in science, I could figure out what this should be able to do. And here's my proof based on what I've done, even though there's no historical precedent behind it.
Right. But then you wouldn't just want to make a bridge that everybody's going to drive across based on mathematics. You would probably want to actually do test bridges. And
of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
And then that would give you some kind of a precedent to say that it works, because you're going through and proving that it's okay and that it works.
Exactly.
So actually, the burden of proof is a good thing.
Well, it's
reasonable.
No, I wouldn't even call it a good thing. I would call it an observation of nature.
Okay.
It's just there, and that's the way things work. So I think this is really important when we talk about philosophical stuff, or even if we start getting into law, or how do we form governments and stuff like this, is that the way that we interact with each other isn't this hazy quasi-religious thing of the mind where we're able to make up the Platonic world of forms and apply that downward onto reality. It's actually the other way around, is we observe reality and say, okay, how do us as humans who have this ability to choose and are kind of complicated, and we can't be predicted in the same way as like throwing a rock,
mm-hmm.
How do we apply what we've observed in reality to our human interactions? And for example, guilty until proven innocent is a perfect example of that. I said it backwards again too.
Yeah.
Innocent until proven guilty. Do you see what you've done to me, mainstream media?
Right.
uh, it's actually based off of the null hypothesis, which is from science, which is to say, okay, if you have an idea of a cause and an effect, we're going to assume that it's untrue unless you could prove otherwise. Because if we don't have that assumption, then we're back to wildly guessing and nobody has any idea what's going on. Well, that same principle applies to our volition. This is where I get the term volitional science network for my YouTube channel. This applies to our volition where, okay, like I said, if I throw a rock, I could use physics to figure out, what's going to happen if I know exactly what all the variables are.
Right.
When you and I are interacting, we don't have that same ability to predict. And so I think what typically happens is people throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, okay, there's no way of making any sort of science with human choice because you just don't know what's going to happen. Where I'm saying, okay, it's a little more difficult, but if we apply the same principles of natural science to volitional science, it'll work. It'll actually work out. It'll be more difficult, but we can actually treat it as a science as opposed to just being like, yeah, people are weird. They make weird decisions and there's no way to figure it out.
Right. Okay. So it can, so with the volitional, is the volitional about making it more predictable or is it just making it more reasonable?
No. So volitional in terms of volitional.
Well, you're talking about, the volitional science.
So
and the purpose.
Volition just means choice.
Right.
Right. Your ability to choose. And I actually got the term from, what's his name? Andrew Galambos, I believe I pronounced that correctly. He's a guy who came up with the term volitional science. And I've heard a few of he's dead now. I heard a few of his lectures from the Peace Revolution podcast, actually. And he goes over a history of the American Revolution, a history of Thomas Paine, and why what Thomas Paine came up with is actually scientifically valid in the literal natural scientist sense, because Thomas Paine was actually a natural scientist. It's funny, we were talking about bridges. Did you know Thomas Paine invented the iron bridge?
Oh, okay. I did not know that.
And Galambos argues that the reason that, because Thomas Paine was actually, we talk about the founding fathers of the United States, it's kind of the founding father of the United States was Thomas Paine. And the other guys that we know as the founding fathers, they took his stuff and formed what we know today as America. Because before Thomas Paine, they left this out they either left it out or didn't emphasize it enough in my history class, is that, did you know that the fighting of the American war between Britain started before anyone had any idea that they wanted to be their own country? So when the fighting started, it was actually the American Rebellion. And what the Americans wanted was representation in Parliament. That this is where no taxation without representation comes from, is they said, look, the king is taxing us for, these things that he's saying that he's protecting us in the world for the French-Indian War or whatever it was, or these other wars that he's got going on. That's fine. But we want you to treat these colonies like I don't know how England was broken up, but you have representatives from different parts of England that come to Parliament and decide what's going to do. We want representatives to come from the colonies here too. We want this to be England. We don't want to be treated as a inferior colony. We want this to actually be part of England. That's what they were fighting over. And the fighting already started before Thomas Paine was even on the continent. Thomas Paine's was English. He was still in England. And he came to the continent. When he arrived, he was very sick for several months. And fighting had already started. Then he wrote the book Common Sense, which attacked the idea of the king and really put forth this idea of we should use reason, and reason being this strictly set, defined rules. Like I mentioned with chess last time, there's these strict rules defining chess. We should use reason to determine how we're going to organize our government. And when I being Thomas Paine, look at the concept of a king gaining hereditary power, it doesn't make sense due to these reasons.
Right.
And that went over the American continent, which happened to be the most literate society that has ever existed on the face of the planet in all history. And they said, oh, hey, well, we're already fighting, so let's just make this an American Revolution instead of an American Rebellion.
Right. So, and I would say that he was actually continuing on the ideas of John Locke.
Yes, and John Locke and Isaac Newton. This is what Andrew Galambos was really trying to emphasize, is that Isaac Newton was really the one revolution that's ever happened to human beings ever. Because Isaac Newton put forth the idea that we can understand the universe through rational principles. And not only can we, here are the rational principles.
Right.
Well, here's the gravity equation. Here's force equals mass times acceleration. Here's the calculus that you need to calculate it. And so it wasn't just that, you know, people were before him were looking for these things, and they just never found them. No one was even looking for them.
Well, and he's also the founder of Star Wars, almost, if you look at it, because he was the first one to say the Force. He actually, no, he did, but no, he translated the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, which was a mystical thing from which is a Hermetic work.
I didn't know about that.
Yes, he had his own translation, and in it he talks. There's actually a sentence from Obi-Wan Kenobi in A New Hope that almost quotes it directly. His translation.
That's funny. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not actually that big of a Star Wars fan, but yeah, that's funny. But Galambos's point was that Thomas Paine was able to create the philosophic ideas that he was able to, and so was John Locke, and so was Spinoza. I can never remember his first name, because all these men were very, very into the natural science generated from the likes of Isaac Newton. Mm-hmm. And what they did is they took their understanding of natural science and applied it to the term that Galambos came up with, volitional science, which adds this component in reality, which is human beings have the ability to make choice. And that the American Revolution and the government that was attempted to be created out of it was the first attempt in human history to apply volitional science in reality.
Right.
Now, Galambos' interpretation, which I agree with, is that it was a failed attempt. That Thomas Paine inaccurately described the problem. Thomas Paine said the problem in government is kings, is hereditary power.
Right.
And his solution to that was representative government. And Galambos points out that, okay, I might have made the same mistake at the time, you know, back in the 1700s, who would have known any better. But right. The actual problem, and any, you know, anarchist or libertarian will tell you this, is the fact that people have power over others, the ability to initiate force over others. It doesn't matter how you give the person that power, whether it's representative government or whether it's hereditary. That's the problem.
Right.
Which is another discussion. But going back to what I mean by volitional, is applying the volitional and the volitional science. That's saying, okay, I am taking the concepts of science and the concepts of the scientific method, applying it to people. And that the core difference being the volition, which is people's ability to choose, which makes it obviously more difficult to analyze and to predict.
So the burden of proof would be a principle found within volitional science.
Yes, but not because volitional science is special, but because the burden of proof is just as valid in law, and it's just as valid in science, and it's just as valid in reason, and it's just as valid in philosophy. And
it's a natural principle. It's a universal principle.
Yes, a natural observable principle.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned something about the null. What was that again?
The null hypothesis.
Null hypothesis. And could you fill us in on that really quick? And your understanding.
So the null hypothesis. Yeah, my understanding of the null hypothesis is that if you're going to say, okay, this cause leads to that effect, I'm going to say these variables determine that outcome. It's assumed that's untrue. That cause does not lead to that effect unless I can provide evidence of the case.
So the one making the claim.
The one making the claim has to come up and say, who says this cause leads to that effect has to. It's assumed that's untrue unless I can produce the evidence that shows that there's a correlation between those two things.
Yes, and evidence can be direct evidence, but it can also be reasoned judgment, correct?
I'm thinking. No, I think you have to have the direct evidence, but the reason and judgment tells you where to look.
Okay.
So, I mean, think of Sherlock Holmes, where it's like, okay, I can come up, if I suspect something based on the evidence that I have, well, that causes me to go look for further evidence to prove that it's actually the case. And I figured out to look for that further evidence by my rational ability. And this is where I believe the repeatability comes from. Because if I say, okay, I've made these observations, here's my evidence to support those observations. Okay, that's great. You need to be able to repeat that if it's going to be true. If we're going to accept that, we're going to say, okay, we should, based on what you said, we should be able to set up an experiment where you're able to predict the outcome based on what you said. If we set that experiment up and you don't predict the outcome, it's something wildly different. Well, even though it looked like it made sense from your original proof, you obviously missed something.
Right. So let's look at not real communism. You know where I'm going with this?
Yeah. Well, this honestly, it's a grammatical fallacy. Define communism.
Okay.
And I'm not telling you to. I'm telling anybody who has ever fucking said that. It's not real communism. Tell me what communism is. They won't be able to tell you.
Right.
So it's I mean, if we're going to look at it from the burden of proof, they're not taking on any sort of burden of proof by saying, okay, this is what I mean by real communism.
Right.
Because if you're going to say it's not real communism and you're not going to tell me what real communism is, you can't prove it or disprove it.
Well, they'll say, yes, they'll give an example. I've heard lots of people give just a myriad of examples of what real communism is. But then, of course, it's never been tried.
Oh, hit me with one.
And it's never been tried.
Hit me with what?
Because reasons. Well, those people were just, they were still too much into power, or that wasn't real socialism. They never really got there. And it's like, well, it feels like people are playing Russian roulette then with this whole not real communism thing.
Okay, so here's the thing with when it comes to not real communism.
Or socialism.
Let's use our rational judgment, which is, okay, you want to bring in utopia, and your only method of doing so is killing everybody. And then you're telling me the only reason it hasn't been successful is it's never been tried. Dude.
No, but real communism,
get the fuck out of here.
Everybody. It's about supporting and loving and being compassionate. And
okay, so describe to me the process of how that would happen. How okay, everybody's going to be compassionate and everybody's going to share. And if somebody doesn't share, what are you going to do with that person?
Right.
Oh, we're going to take his stuff. Well, what if he defends that stuff?
Then we kill him.
Okay, so I was right.
Right.
I used some deductive reasoning to figure out that you're full of shit, that you're making stuff up and you're being manipulative. And this is honestly where I wanted to go with this, is that everything that we just talked about isn't interesting at all if the other person isn't actually interested in figuring out what the truth is.
Right. So that's the win-lose. The not real communism is those people are going to be win-lose and not win-win in their burden of proof.
Right. And I will make that claim because, as we talked about before, Marxism views all interactions as win-lose by definition.
Mm-hmm. Oppressor and oppressed.
I saw this really funny meme a while back, and it went something like this. It said, at first they came for the communists, and I wasn't a communist, so I didn't say anything.
Mm-hmm.
And then things were pretty great, and they didn't have to come for anybody else.
Right.
Yeah, because, to shamelessly pull that meme apart, there's the phrase that we always heard, at first they came for the journalists, and I wasn't a journalist, so I didn't say anything. And then they came for these people, and I wasn't one of those people, and I didn't say anything. And you go through that several times. Then they came for me, and
There was nobody left to defend
There
me.
was nobody left to defend me. Well, the people that are coming for everybody are the fucking communists.
Right.
Right? Because by definition, they see everything as oppressive, and the only way to deal with it is physical violence. That's it, like in the first few pages of the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah.
So, when communism is it's kind of an exception to this discussion, because I don't need to hear your arguments. As soon as you say communism, I understand what the basic premises of communism is. So I don't care what else that you have to say.
Right. That's not just a no, but that's a hell no.
Yeah. It's like, well, it's not real communism, because I'm like, unless you're defining communism as something other that everything is oppression and oppressed, and the only way to deal with it is physical violence, as per your Communist Manifesto, then if it's something different from that, let me know. And if it is something different from that, you need to stop being a fucking retard and use a different word. Because the entirety of humanity has a very, very negative experience with that word. And by negative experience, I mean like millions and millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people dying, and who knows how many billions just suffering. And if you're too stupid to be like, well, I'm going to take that word and polish it up a little bit and make it look a little better. If you're too stupid to think that to understand that that's not, to not understand that that's not going to work, I don't know what to tell you.
Well, that's where you just start putting boundaries. I'm not going to have this conversation with a communist because I already know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, because of all, everything in historical precedent, really, that I'm not willing to risk not real communism just to try it one more time. Because if it turns out that way and even one person dies because of it, bad idea.
Another meme I saw in late stage capitalism. This meme came out right when there were, I think it was in Thailand, like that group of boys got stuck in that cave when the water came up. And wasn't it Elon Musk sent in some crazy prototype machines to get robots to get them out of there? And so the meme went, in late stage capitalism, billionaires use crazy machines to save people out of from being trapped in caves that are where the water came up. And in late stage communism, everyone's dead.
Yeah.
So I mean, this communism has never actually been tried thing. It's like, look, dude, your premise is kill everybody. Mm-hmm. It's in the first few pages of the fucking book. Don't waste my time. I'm not interested in anything that you have to say after that. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, if someone starts promoting communism, the natural response is to put up your fists, because you have like.
Well, but they're not holding the burden of proof. But this is the whole point. They're presenting their ideas without holding the burden of proof.
You mean when they should?
Yes.
Yes.
So
what should be an indicator for you, the person receiving this, saying, okay, burden of proof isn't even interesting. We're not even at that level where such a concept is even useful.
Right. But this is the thing. We don't have to go and entertain such discussions when somebody's not going to hold a burden of proof, and they're going to put it on us to prove that it's bad.
Absolutely.
It's historical precedent is like, seriously. I'm reading a book right now about a Chinese lady that left China and went to Britain in 1992 or in the early 90s. And it's going through the Cultural Revolution and all that kind of stuff, and it's horrendous. Yeah. And it's like, seriously, they're not holding the burden of proof. And if you can't, there's no historical precedent.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I read the Gulag Archipelago, and I listened to it on an audiobook, man, there were some times I had to stop and just be like, dude, my fucking day is ruined, man. That was so awful. I couldn't have even comprehended it if you asked me to. Tell me to come up with the most awful thing I could possibly think of. I wouldn't even come close to the awfulness of what was described in this book. And to sit here and be like, well, it just wasn't tried the right way is like, God, oh my God.
Read that book and then have a conversation.
Oh my God. I just can't even comprehend.
Well, this would be the boundary. I'm more than happy to have this conversation with you when you actually.
No, I wouldn't even say that. If someone is
No,
putting
not this
forth,
conversation, a conversation.
yeah. What I'm saying is, if someone's putting forth that sort of stuff, it's like reach for your sword, man. It's not like I don't want anything to deal with you. This goes back to that meme that I said. Is at first they came for the communists and then everything was great. It's like, dude, there's someone dangerous on the block.
Mm-hmm.
That this needs to be. There need to be more measures than simply, oh, we're just not going to talk to them.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm not sitting here implying I know what those measures are,
Right.
but again, this
Well, it's a state of war. It's whether they're conscious of it or not, they have placed themselves in a state of war against you. And John Locke says when somebody places them in a state of war against you, it is okay for you to treat them like an animal, a beast of prey, and deal with
yes, yes, absolutely,
it.
absolutely,
And that's natural. That's actually a universal principle that it is okay to defend ourselves against such things.
yes, absolutely,
So
absolutely.
that's why
So,
I like John Locke. He's one of my favorites.
so you wrote an article. You sent me this
Yes.
about the burden of proof, and I wanted to read something that you had in here. I'm looking at
Yes.
my other screen. That's why my head's facing this way. So you were talking about essentially what we just talked about how the burden of proof is really important for two people who want to discuss. And you wrote, if I make a claim and instead of asking me for evidence to back up my claims, a person attacks me or my character for making my claims, the burden of proof is now on them to back up their accusations of me. After the accusation is properly sorted out, through the accuser backing up their accusations with proper evidence, then the discussion about the original claim can resume, but not until then because the two situations are unrelated. This is totally true. However, if you get to the point where someone attacks your character, there isn't really any until we can get back to having the burden of proof in the right spot. The I mean, this is really a throwing your pearls before swine sort of situation where you're like, well, Mr. Person who's getting into my face about talking about we haven't really tried communism until you reassume the burden of proof. I can't have a proper discussion with you. It's like, yeah,
Well,
you're on two different
let me give you an
planes of
example.
existence.
Let me give you an example, and this has actually worked in the past.
Uh huh.
If somebody comes in, oh, you're just a bigot. Oh, really? Well, please, I'm not going to talk about what I'm talking about here, but tell me, please, what is your evidence for this? What have you observed about me? And give your evidence why this is, is this systemic? Is this something that you have observed over a long period of time? Like, I know I just met you. Okay, well then, how do you know that I'm this? And they usually, well, kind of like an assumption, right? I mean, and then we after discussing that, and then me basically pointing out how unreasonable they're being, then we can get back to the original thing. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Oftentimes it just shuts them off and they leave.
I
So
think that's a
I would say
perfect
the majority of the
definition.
time they shut up and leave, but sometimes they actually do apologize, and
Uh-huh.
then we talk about the original issue.
I think that's a perfect description of a normie.
A normie, please explain.
So, this new term was being used for a while before I picked up on it. A normie is this kind of condescending term, I guess the alt-right generated, to talk about people who they're not communists, they're not like socialists, they're just people that they're typically centrists. And by
Mhm.
centrist, I mean, remember, think of the meme, the centrist meme of the guy with the really big brain who's right about everything because he doesn't have any opinions.
Right.
Um, they're almost functioning humans.
Hmm.
Like it's like they have the capacity, but it just hasn't been connected properly yet. As opposed to someone like Antifa, where if you said what you just said about, please explain to me why you're a bigot, they'll just, hit you in the side of the head with paint like they did with me.
Right.
Uh, so there is a small cut of population, and I think you brought up a very important point of people that they have the capacity to be reasonable, but they haven't had the opportunity yet.
Right.
I think it's super, super, super important that if we find one of those people, we convert them immediately. And I think what you did by inducing that shock into them, where you say, okay, explain to me why I'm a bigot, if they have the capacity and they start trying to think of a reason. Well, I mean, the reason they hesitate is because they're trying to think of a reason and they can't. Well, that means they have a capacity for reason. Mm-hmm. If they just start throwing more insults or even get violent with you, then it's like, well, I'm wasting my time with this guy.
Right. They're not holding the burden of proof, and they're all obviously just going to use, that's the weaponized burden of proof, because they can make insults without any proof.
Correct. Which is, we talked about narcissism a little bit last
time.
They
can judge an entire person's life, their history, based on one thing that was written without going into,
Yeah. Well, and I like the way Stefan Molyneux has broken this down. What people are doing when they switch the burden of proof on you like that is they're trying to get you to self-attack.
Right.
And, his favorite thing that he likes to repeat, that's not an argument, that's not an argument, that's not an argument.
Yeah.
When someone comes up to you and says, well, you're a bigot, well, that's not an argument. There's nothing to, bigot what? What do you mean by bigot? And like you said, where's your burden of proof? What they're doing to you is try to get you in a position where you're like, oh, I'm not a bigot because of...
Yes, exactly.
Well, they're not interested in burden of proof, and then you're trying to prove that the reason you're not, well, if they were interested at all, they would have followed these rules.
The whole thing, yes, exactly.
Drawn out already.
They're trying to get you to be defensive. And if you can not bite, and you can know where your responsibility begins and ends, and you know that they hold the burden of, so you're making a claim, and most people think, well, I'm making a claim, and somebody comes in and attacks, and then they defend themselves against that. Well, why do we have to defend ourselves against that? That's the thing. We don't. They have to actually prove why they're, what they're saying is reasonable and true. And so we can actually avoid a lot of arguments and a lot of spinning our wheels. And we could say basically, like talk to the hand kind of thing, because we're not going to take on the burden of proof from them and start defending ourselves.
I'll take that a step further, where if somebody's doing that to you, you have the right to defend yourself. I don't mean physically, I mean emotionally, where you now have the right to humiliate that person. You now have the right to ostracize that person. You now have the right to accuse that person of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to do that. Mm-hmm. Simply from the stance of, I want that person to be more careful spewing bullshit to random strangers. I want him to think the last time he bumped into me and say, okay, I might bump into a guy that doesn't take my shit.
Yeah.
In fact, my Aikido instructor pointed this out, was from, there's a great scene in Gran Torino. Have you seen Gran Torino?
Yes, I have. Good movie.
Where Clint Eastwood, and I didn't watch that movie for the longest time because I thought it was like an Asian drag race movie. And my cousin finally got me to watch it. I'm like, oh, this is a Clint Eastwood movie? Oh, shit, yeah, I'll watch this. I love Clint Eastwood, right? So there's a scene where so Clint Eastwood is kind of quasi-adopting this Hmong, I think that's the people, family, that this ethnicity that came from as refugees from the Vietnam War. And he's finding himself in his neighborhood slowly having more and more of these people in it. And there's this daughter of his neighbor, who's this pretty young woman, who gets accosted by these black guys downtown, and he's driving by in a truck. And so he gets out of a truck, and he's like 70 years old, and there's these, young, tough black guys that are messing with this Hmong girl. And he gets out, and he's like, you guys need to get out of here. And they start messing with him, and he's like, that every once in a while you mess with somebody that you really shouldn't have messed with. I'm that guy. You just bumped into him, right? And I don't remember if he actually beats them up or he just kind of scares them to get off or whatever happened in the movie. But that's what I'm saying, is we need a little bit more of that character in ourselves, where I want those guys represented by the guys picking on this girl to be a little bit careful about who they pick a fight with. Mm-hmm. And not think that they could just get away with, I'll just do whatever I want, and then if someone doesn't like it, I'll just get aggressive in their face. Okay,
Is there a way to probe to find out if that's the case? So you can tell somebody's being kind of aggressive, but you can also ask a few questions first before you know, go full bore into the conversation like that. Like, I mean,
Absolutely. And I think at this point, we're talking about a level of skill, right?
mhm,
Once you start becoming aware of these sort of concepts, you start being able to refine it and say, okay, when should I be aggressive? Or when do I need to give the person the benefit of the doubt? Because not only are we trying to defend ourselves from sophists, like I said, we're also looking for that normie who's on the fence.
yeah.
Because that's like finding gold.
Hmm.
Don't just throw that away. So you're right, there's some probing that you have to do, and I mean, we could talk about when that should be, but honestly, it's really about practice. Socratic questioning, like you just said, tell me why I'm a bigot. What are the things that you've seen from me in the past that leads you to think that way? The way they react to a question like that is going to tell you a lot. If it really gets them to think, I mean, even if it shuts them down and makes them walk away, that's a hell of a lot better than someone getting louder, screaming at you, okay, you're not just a bigot, you're a racist and a sexist and a xenophobe.
Yeah. Then you go after them.
And then you're like, oh my God, do I have to deal with this shit? Ugh.
By the way, I would make a distinction. I would say that it's being defensive. So when you say we need to know when to be aggressive, I don't think there's ever a reason to be aggressive, and I don't think we have to be. And I
I
think
think we're about to make a
Hmm?
grammatical fallacy on an unclear definition of defensive and aggressive.
Yeah. Well, let me just
Go
say,
ahead.
let me define my terms.
Yeah.
So I would say that you have the non-aggression principle on one side and you have the self-defense principle on the other. And this is the Mark Passio thing.
Right.
And that the non-aggression is the feminine and the self-defense is the masculine. And that anytime you clean the clock with somebody, it's because they came and they attacked you. You didn't go to their house. They came to yours. So it's my Facebook wall they came to. It's my, my thing.
Right.
And they came there. They knocked, in a rude way.
They came into your space.
Yes, they came to my space. So if they come into my space and they act like, a douchebag, then it's time to clean the clock with them, make an example of them. And I think also there's even some, I would say even some mystical or kind of, not mystical, but not psychological either. There's a principle, I can't even think of the name right now. Anyways, that when you assert yourself, you're not going to be challenged like that again. Just because you yourself have proven to yourself that you really can take care of yourself and defend yourself.
Yeah, people get to pick up on that.
Yeah. Like I don't have certain discussions anymore. It just doesn't happen anymore because I've defended myself so well in the past that for whatever reason now I'm not challenged like that anymore. Mm-hmm. But there are certain challenges that come in, or I'll see something going on with a friend and I'll help them out with it. But in a rare occasion, like one time I went into a conversation with a guy who was being kind of belligerent with my friend. And so I just started doing a Socratic dialogue with him. And he got to the point where he says, well, I can see you know what you're really talking about. You made me think, thanks, goodbye. And he was gone. And so he was like a normie that kind of, I put him in his place without ever being aggressive or being, without ever having to use force, commiserate force.
I didn't get a definition out of you for aggressive yet, but I think it's this. Are you saying when you use aggressive, you're insinuating the initiation of the force? Uh-huh. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So
maybe assertive is a better word to use when we're talking about.
Yeah, I will assert myself in my space. In my space, I will assert myself, and I will make anybody who comes into my space pay. Mm-hmm. If they are not doing so in a manner that's consensual.
Yeah.
So, but I think that's just the alpha male mentality. Now I'm just going to protect me and my own, and I have the right to do that.
Yep.
So in that way, I don't think it's ever being aggressive to clean somebody's clock if they are coming into your space.
Yeah. So if we're using the definition, aggressive implies the initiation, then absolutely.
Yeah. So I had somebody, it was kind of interesting. I made something about suffering. And because suffering is a legal term. And also, if you look at just the meaning of the word, it means tolerance and to consent. And so I said, whatever you're suffering through, you're consenting to. And remove your suffering and you remove your consent. And so, but one person who was New Age came and was like, oh, no, I don't think that's true, blah, 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 and gave reasons because of starving kids in Africa. And then somebody else came and said, oh, I just hate this New Age bullshit. So I had a New Ager arguing with me, and then somebody who's not a New Ager apparently also calling me a New Ager. And I was just using the psychological and also just the meaning of the word, just the straight up meaning of the word. Like, it's implied consent. Suffering is a legal word for implied consent. If you are suffering through something, you have the ability to say no to it, and you don't. And you are actually consenting to it. So whatever you are suffering through, you are consenting to, period. And that gives us strength. That gives us hope. That gives us power, because we can actually stop consent through ending our suffering. We can take control of that. We can take charge of our lives, and it's a very empowering thing. But then he said New Age. I was like, oh, okay, well, why am I New Age? This is a legal...
I'm using the old version of the word. Yeah.
Right. And so I just kind of threw... And of course, what happens basically at that point is he got in another jab and then ran. You know?
And again, it's why I try to avoid shit on Facebook, because it's just... It really rewards the troll.
Mm-hmm. There's no incentive for them to hold the burden of proof, because there's no real world repercussions.
Well, there's no real world repercussions. And on top of that, it's, for whatever reason, I think this is true on any internet forum, but it's particularly true on Facebook and YouTube, simply because if as a bystander, I come by and I look at maybe 10 plus comments, I don't have to scroll through them all to see what happened like I would on a forum. It shortens them, and I have to click view more. So what happens is whoever said the last thing looks right, because it's there unchallenged. Mm-hmm. And because of the nature of it, you have to take turns, because I don't know what you're thinking until you've actually written it down, thought about it, corrected it, and hit send. Well, what you're doing is it looks like whoever said the last thing is the other person is backing down. Mm-hmm. That's just what it looks like. It's just what it looks like.
For a win-lose person, it might look like that.
Well, I think it looks like that to anybody. I mean, when I see it, I personally am curious, and if I'm interested enough to even care, I'll click on the other comments and see, okay, what was said. But it still looks like, even to me, that got left unchallenged.
Right.
And you have no idea why the other person never responded. They could have forgot. They could have gotten busy. They may have stopped caring. They may have actually lost. You have no idea. But it just sits there unchallenged. And it not only sits there unchallenged, the person trolling has the opportunity, I talked about this before, to write something out uninterrupted.
Without a pattern interrupt.
Right? So if you and I are talking right now and I don't like what you're saying, I could start to interrupt you. Mm-hmm. And there's a psychology that goes on there where if I'm successful in interrupting you, I gain alpha points. Mm-hmm. Right? And we're always looking at that when we see two people having a dialogue. Well, that ability is completely removed from these internet interactions, particularly on like Facebook and YouTube.
Right.
However, we still have the psychology to look for it. Mm-hmm. So that I really try to avoid having any sort of discussion on those things, because it's just stupid.
So what about, like, I mean, because I'm involved in a lot of fair-minded conversations on Facebook and YouTube and elsewhere.
Oh, it does happen. I'm not saying 100% don't do it. I'm just saying that you're more than likely to get sucked into something stupid if you choose to participate.
Right.
But go ahead. I interrupted.
No, the thing that I've noticed, at least with me in these situations, is when I come down. Okay, I had a discussion with somebody the other day on the New Zealand shooting, and I was really trying to understand something, and it had to do with actually your four circuits. So I was trying to integrate something. I was trying to understand about how this whole thing works. And I don't need to get into those, but I kind of was in this discussion. It was getting annoying, and I was like, what is it that I really need to learn? And I learned how to set a boundary, and I saw how I was behaving in the moral / philosophical, And then I set a boundary, and I basically said, if you want to talk to me, you're going to have to come up to the moral and philosophical, because you are not looking at any of the philosophy of this. You're only looking at, you're being very narrow-minded, and you're looking at it from a very one-dimensional logic, monologic actually, point of view. And so if we're going to look at this, we're going to have to look at it like this, not like this.
How do you respond?
He didn't. So, but I felt completed when I wrote that. I felt so complete when I wrote it.
It's like you found the key that opens the lock, right?
Yes.
Or it's like, that's what I was looking for. I can go through.
Like if I would have, I could have gotten sucked down into this lower level of reason and emotion. And I'm not saying that reason and emotion are bad, but when you're in the moral and the philosophic, then it obviously includes those things. Reason is, is included within the moral.
I'm going to reinterpret what you said a little bit differently.
Okay.
Which is, the reason that you were successful is you did get sucked down. As you said, I'm going to stop trying to play up here in moral world, because you're not up here with me. I'm like in the attic, and you're chopping at the foundation with an axe.
Okay. I'm
going to go downstairs and interact with you and say, look, you're chopping at this foundation with an axe, and I'm not going to waste my time up there until you stop and come up with me.
Right.
And he wasn't interested, so he walked off.
Yeah, and that was a boundary. That's what we would call setting a boundary. So or a minimum standard. My minimum standard is I have conversations up here. I'm going to drop down just to tell you that I have conversations up there. And if you want to continue having a conversation with me, this is where we're going to go.
Yep. Or you're going to leave. Or if you choose not to do either of those, we're going to have a very bad interaction, and you are probably going to like it less than me.
Yeah. And because he was in my group, it's my space, my turf, my territory. Mm-hmm. And I would have humiliated him for everybody else in the group. And then at that point, I would have removed him.
Yep.
So without giving him an opportunity to say something else. So the whole point, I have no problems. I like Ben Shapiro's thing about why to debate a leftist. And that's basically, if there's people looking and you have an audience, do it, but humiliate them. And
well, there's another reason to debate a leftist is the idea that there's no such thing as bad media.
Yeah.
Because if you have something that's exciting and worth watching, you're going to draw a lot of eyes simply for the excitement and the fight, which you're going to get access to a lot more viewership than you otherwise wouldn't have.
Well, I'm not talking about like debate one-on-one, but I was just talking about in these interactions in the comments. And
okay, never mind.
Yeah.
I understand.
I have even less incentive to debate a leftist when it comes to that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I got to get moving here. Do you have anything to tie this up?
Okay. So intellectual self-defense, the key is boundaries. The key is knowing if you are not if they won't take the burden of proof, and it's incumbent on them to take the burden of proof, we don't have to go any further, and we don't have to feel bad about not going further. Like, people get sucked into these arguments, into these discussions, because they think they hold the burden of proof, and it's fair-minded to do so. And they trick themselves out of it's almost like they guilt themselves out of, like, oh, I should be fair-minded and listen to what this person has to say, even though it's not on you. It's on them.
Well, if we view everything from the Second Circuit, and I know I haven't talked on recording about what that means.
Yeah.
If we view everything from a world of dominance and submission, every act, this is what I'll say about Marxism, is an act of somebody is an oppressor and somebody is the oppressed. If we're viewing things from that point, I lost my train of thought. We were talking about the burden of proof. And we were talking about how yes, if we're viewing things from that point, it doesn't make any sense at all to try to say, okay, who's got the burden of proof? Mm-hmm. To even talk about burden of proof, it just isn't even interesting. It's not useful, and in fact, it's a bad idea, because if someone is interacting with you on that win-lose situation, by even thinking about the burden of proof, you're losing. Because you're not participating in the fight. There's a fight going on, and you're going, well, I think this, while he's going and punching you in the face.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what happens is a lot of us have been trained to do that, particularly through our families, but I'll say even like the school system, or I guess if you went to church a lot or something, like a church might do this to you, or it could come from anywhere.
Yeah.
Big thing, families. I think second biggest thing is school. Is that you've been trained that I am allowed to attack you, and you're not allowed to defend yourself. And so what people do when they've been put in that situation is you've got to say something to calm that other person down, because that's the only tool that you have. So you learn to rationalize, and I think this is very descriptive is not the word I want, common among people who have very, very strong rational capacities, is that when they were young, they were put in a situation where they were constantly harassed
Mm-hmm.
and forced to do things. And the only tool that they had was to try to explain to this attacker why they shouldn't attack them, or why they shouldn't attack so hard. And what the attacker would do is they'd lob an accusation and see how the other person dealt with it. And I mean, like you said, that puts the person on defensive where they're walking back, and every step that you take back, you try to defend yourself from all these blows, and you just slowly lose. And what it does is it allows the attacker to have you use all the energy to defend yourself in this fight, because what you're doing to defend yourself isn't actually a defense.
Well, I would say that is because you don't have necessarily a very strong sense of self yet. And once you know your sense of self and what your responsibility is to your sense of self, then when somebody makes an accusation against you, you would know that, hey, that's that accusation is like out of left field and isn't really connected to what we're talking about here. And now I know that the responsibility is not there.
If we're equals. If we're not equals, and you do have the ability to physically dominate me, and there's really no recourse that I have about it.
Right.
Now we're really in a situation where I don't have the opportunity to say, okay, I'm setting a boundary, and I'm done with you. A lot of us I grew up in that sort of situation where I would be punished for drawing the boundary. For attempting to draw a boundary, I would be punished specifically for that. I was not allowed to have boundaries. And so when I graduate the household, I have been psychologically conditioned that it's not that I don't have any boundaries, I'm not allowed to have them. Right. I will be punished for attempting to create a boundary. So the only quasi-defense I had were things like lying.
Mm-hmm.
Or things like trying to
distract the person with words. A sense of self. That's also, you're not allowed to have a sense of self.
Exactly. Because, I mean, in order to have a sense of self, I have to have a boundary, because there's a difference between me and what's not me.
Right. And so that's what is my responsibility, what's not my responsibility. This is my sense of self. But if you're a kid and you've been dominated your whole life, or, your parents have dominated you and they've kind of taught you that you're just an extension of them, then when somebody else comes and does the same thing, you're just an extension of them.
You're already been trained to do that.
Right. Yes. And so setting a boundary, you don't even have a concept of a boundary because you don't have a concept of a self.
Right. And you're not aware of self-defense.
Right.
You don't understand that you're allowed to defend yourself.
You can't defend yourself if you don't have a self.
Yes. So I think what happens, it's very, very common for people who are very smart. I think that, there's this trope of the 90-pound nerd who if you beat him up, he'll do your math homework for you.
Yeah.
Is because they've, with no other place for the energy to go, they're not allowed to put it in their bodies to defend themselves or to accomplish things in the real universe. It goes all up to their head, and they get really smart. And that's the way that they try to deal with the world, is by being very, very smart. And the unfortunate aspect of that is, if that smartness runs into a dominate submit interaction, it just loses.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that I really try to communicate to people, is that, yes, you're very smart. I need you to let that go. You need some muscle. Like, I'm pretty weak right now. I actually hurt my foot. I busted a ligament in my foot,
Mhm.
and I can't do my normal routine, and particularly my leg has already atrophied.
Yeah.
Like I look like a 90-pound weakling on my left leg right now. But you need some physical muscle, you need some emotional muscle to deal with people fighting with you, because your head, your reason can't interact with that. It just loses.
Well, this is why what we work on with clients, and we use the tools of philosophy to help them work through their emotional upsets and set healthy boundaries. But also,
Mm-hmm.
you can discover meaning, work through traumas, all different kinds of things that you can do when you learn things like Socratic dialogue and processing, using learning logic and burden proof and those kinds of things. Is you're able to apply those tools to yourself to actually increase your emotional intelligence. But it's also going to help you increase other things, and just even your own strength of will, because the more of a sense of self you have, the more clear sense of where you begin and end. And you're
Mm-hmm.
going to know what's your responsibility, what's not your responsibility. You're going to start interacting in more of a collaborative fashion in your interactions, especially your relationships, like, your personal relationships with your children and your lover. And we've had really great success in teaching people how to use the tools of philosophy and to direct them inwards and to develop their self, because now that you have a sense of self, I guess this is actually a really good way to end this discussion, is that the burden of proof really doesn't matter if you don't have a sense of self.
Yeah, because who's proving?
Right. And because
We have
it's
no
all about
subject.
responsibility.
Yeah.
Burden of proof is all about responsibility, and boundaries are about responsibility and having a self and knowing what yourself is compared to yourself. The difference, the distinctions between yourself and myself.
Mm-hmm.
That's the boundary between us. And now we're going to know there's going to be this thing called the burden of proof that's going to kind of be involved in this interaction, and that has to do with responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really know how else to wrap it up, but I think that
I
yes,
think
you
it's
need
a good stopping point.
need a sense of self to really manage the burden of proof and to understand it and to work with it. Thank
Excellent.
you very much, Dylan. It was a really good conversation. I enjoyed it. Once again, we'll have to do this more.
I'm into that.
Awesome.
I'll talk to you soon. Have a great night.
Take care, man.
Bye bye.
Bye.